Welcome to the Ohio Yearly Meeting Education and Presentation Series on a brief synopsis of the Principles and Testimonies of the Religious Society of Friends, published in 1913. This is session number 11, held on 5th of 12th month, 2023. The text we're reading from can be found on the Ohio Yearly Meeting website, the link to which will be in the show notes. I will be reading some passages followed by comments and explanations by Henry Jason and Conrad Lindes from Ohio Yearly Meeting. Last week, we finished the section on the Bible and are about to start a section on plain speech and plain clothing on the second paragraph of page 27. Before we do so, Henry, I believe that you would like to return to some important elements of the previous section. So over to you.
Right. There are two or three things I'd like to just add to what was said last time, along with looking at these excerpts I had given last time on reading and understanding the Bible. First excerpt was from Origen of Alexandria, an early Christian who lived in Alexandria, was a prolific writer, probably one of the most prolific Christian writers of all time. In later centuries, there was some controversy over him, but during his period in which he lived, he actually died a martyr. He died from his wounds in 253 AD. This excerpt, I think, is very important. It's from his commentaries on the Gospel according to John, written between 226 and 232 AD and later. And I think these are very relevant because it kind of is the understanding we Quakers have. And what he is saying here, I'll read. I do not condemn the evangelists, that is, the gospel writers, if to serve their mystical view, they have in some way rearranged actual historical events in an order other than that in which they occurred, so as to tell of what happened in one place as if it had happened in another, or of what happened at a certain time as if it had happened at another time, and to introduce into what was said in a certain way some variations of their own. 4. They propose to speak the truth both pneumatically, that is, spiritually, and somatically, that is, literally, insofar as possible. And where this was not possible, to prefer the pneumatic, the spiritual, to the somatic, the literal. They often preserve the pneumatic, the spiritual truth, in what some might call a somatic, literal falsehood. Again, they often preserve the pneumatic, the spiritual truth, in what some might call a somatic, a literal falsehood. The next excerpt is from a letter from an early Quaker, Isaac Pennington, whose writings are really beautiful. And in this letter, he talks about reading the Bible, how to read it, and position one should take. And he says in this excerpt, and the end, that is the goal of all words, is to bring men to the knowledge, that is, to the experience of things beyond what words can utter. So learn of, that is, learn from the Lord to make a right use of the scriptures, which is by esteeming them in their right place and prizing that above them which is above them. And finally, I can't find the exact quote, but this is said in various places, and I know Robert Barclay, I recall, said it. And so I'm paraphrasing what he said. In reading a Bible passage, seek the spiritual signification, that is, the spiritual meaning behind the words. And of course, in all these cases, one needs the Holy Spirit, that Spirit of Christ in us, to help us to discern the true spiritual meaning of those words. I also did not read this last week, but I want to read a couple of sentences from Origen of Alexandria again with regard to the Bible. He's talking about three different levels of understanding the Bible. He says here, each man then ought to have the meaning of the sacred scriptures inscribed in a threefold manner upon his own soul. Thus, the simple man may be edified as if by the flesh of the Scriptures, for so we name the obvious sense. Second, he that has ascended somewhat may be edified as if by the soul of the Scriptures. And finally, the perfect man, again, may be edified by the spiritual law, which casts a shadow of the good things to come. For just as man consists of body, soul, and spirit, so also does Scripture, which is the gift of God's bounty for the salvation of men. I thought it'd just be important to say that because among so many Christian denominations, there's such a strong tendency to literalism that even the early Friends were opposed to, and very much so because they were fighting literal understandings of like water baptism compared to the true need for a spiritual baptism and so forth. One last thing I'd like to just comment on from last week was with regard to that last paragraph on higher criticism, which is what we in the 20th century find so often in so many different seminaries, schools of divinity of Christianity. And what conservative Friends, when they wrote this, were really concerned about was this attitude of taking the Bible as like any other text and just analyzing it, dividing it into different ways of looking at it and whatnot. But they are missing completely that spiritual sense that really is what we need to seek as conservative Friends, that true, that's what should be taught. That is what we say is necessary to dig deep what is really being said there behind those words, under those words, the foundation of those words, whatever they may be.
The gospel, the ultimate explanation of God's work in history with his people, is that we be elevated from, delivered from, brought away from the parts of our human nature that lead us to do evil and to lead us into a life of humble obedience to God. That's throughout the Bible from beginning to end. We need to start with that understanding of the context before we can look at any specific detail to try to understand what the detail means.
So, reading from the text here, Friends have long been recognized by their peculiar simplicity of speech, with regard to which it may be briefly stated that not until about the time of George Fox did the use of the plural pronoun as addressed to one person obtain foothold in public usage. Ecclesiastical and magisterial officers, pompous and jealous of their petty honour, became unwilling to be accounted of no more importance than the common people, and began to require their attendants and others to address them as you, your honour, your worship, etc. Thus originated the plural form of speech to one person, which has become well nigh universal among English-speaking people.
I think we need to understand English going back 500 years ago. What we're talking about here are the pronouns for the second person. What now is the general you, your, yours, referring to a person that we are addressing, that we are talking to. In earlier English, those pronouns were used only for addressing more than one person. The singular form was thou, thee, thy, thine, and that was used only with regard to one person, a single person. What was happening in English of early Friends was that the plural form was beginning to be used in address to those who are in a higher station than ourselves in speaking, so that those in power, our bosses or whatever, wanted to be addressed with this plural form, you or ye, which was also then the subject form. rather than the thou. And they would get very upset when people would be not honoring them by using that plural form, ye, you, rather than the thou, thee, which was the way the English had been ever since its beginning, hundreds of years. So this isn't only an issue in English. This has happened in many other languages as well, in European languages, sometimes in very different ways. I can say in Polish, in addressing someone in a polite form, what you use is the word Lord or lady. Do you want to eat? You'd use the word pan, P-A-N, to a man, which means Lord. And for a lady, pani. This is what we're seeing here. Again, it has a very similar thing. I need to also mention in other languages too, you may have a variety of different pronouns being used for the person you're addressing. In actuality, like in a language like in Korean, there are several levels of politeness, all having to do with your status and the status of the person you're speaking to. So it becomes very complex rather than what friends were saying back in the earliest 1600s was we should just be very clear about if it's one person, we do not want to puff them up by addressing them with the plural form. And this was a real problem, unfortunately, for so many folks in those days because Quakers wanted to be truthful, and yet by addressing someone with the singular form, that got them into a lot of trouble.
Yes, I think from my reading of George Fox and others, it was the primary reason for sticking with the singular form was honesty. I'm speaking to one person, so I'll use the singular pronoun. These issues of honor and pride and so on, flattery, were certainly why the other people didn't like to be addressed that way. But I don't think the original purpose of Friends in sticking with the singular was to avoid pompous titles, but just to be honest in their speech. Just as nowadays we're facing issues of using honest pronouns versus pronouns that are not honest.
Returning to the text, quick to detect error and pride in this as in other things, George Fox and his co-laborers declined its use, as well as the use of complementary terms and titles, which likewise originated in pride. On account of their faithful adherence to conviction, cruel and unrelenting persecution fell upon the early friends because of these testimonies, which today are so lightly esteemed by many bearing our name.
Being forced to say something like your honor when that person may not be an honorable person, or your worship where you are not worshiping that person. They felt that this was just giving in to the arrogance, the egotism of that person who wants to be addressed that way. And they felt that we are all equal under God's eyes, in God's eyes, and that they were just such sticklers for truth. It may have been Fox was referring to how Paul, when he was talking to King Felix, I may be getting the name wrong, was just addressing him as king. No fancy titles, and he was using the singular form in the original Greek. But again, it really had to do with being truthful and not anything but truthful and honest.
Do I remember correctly, Henry Conrad, that another related objection that the early friends made is that the people who would demand the plural pronoun for themselves when referring to God would use a singular pronoun and thus put themselves higher than God.
Yes. Even the singular pronoun has changed. Both the pronouns, singular and plural, have changed from what they were in the early 1600s. The plural form ye, spelled Y-E, no longer is used. It's replaced by you. And likewise, in the singular, the thou was replaced by thee, which is what conservative friends would be using. They'd be saying thee rather than thou.
Returning to the text, Our avoidance of the popular names of the days of the week is not simply to be singular, but they were borrowed from heathen mythology. The days thus named having been devoted to the worship of the idol or heathen deity, whose name is thus perpetuated. Against this recognition of pagan superstition, Friends have a testimony to bear.
Yes, I mean, again, since Friends saw themselves as true Christians, why should they be using words like Sunday or Moon Day or Woden's Day, all these gods, Saturn Day? And again, they just felt this is inappropriate. So they were real sticklers for being honest and saying and using speech.
One of the Old Testament prophets, I can't remember which one, specifically said that we shouldn't let pagan names even come out of our mouths. It gets difficult when one talks about first day instead of Sunday or whatever in the general public. It's often necessary to translate. But when I do that, I ask people, well, what days of the week were in the Bible? First day, God made heaven and earth. First day of the week, Christ was raised from the dead. There are no days of the week in Scripture. They're just numbers.
Right. In the Greek, they are numbers. A couple of others are preparation day for Sabbath, and so. But again, otherwise, they're numbers also in the original Greek.
Could you help explain the word singular in the context of is not simply to be singular?
Not to set ourselves apart in some special way. In other words, not just to say, oh, we're different from you, so we'll use these different words.
Returning to the text, for somewhat similar reasons, we avoid the popular names of the months, using instead the numeral designation, this being not only more correct, but more convenient, as attested by the large number of business firms using this system.
I have read somewhere that the use of numbers, for the various months of the year 1 through 12, actually began with Quakers. I think that might be what's being said here too. In some languages, I know in Chinese, the months are just numbered. They're not given names. You have names of Caesars, Julius and Augustus, and also some of the months, September, October, November, December, are actually numbers in the original Latin. But the beginning of the year was switched to January, where it used to be beginning in March, because we would add an extra day every fourth year, leap year, at the end of the year, which would be the February 29th. And today, among conservative friends, I know myself, I use both. And if I think I'm going to be misunderstood, I will use the conventional names, because I think today, clearly less so than 300 years ago, 400 years ago, I think we have less recognition as English speakers of hearing those gods' names there, because they've been so changed in pronunciation.
I think in the Jewish calendar, wasn't Passover in the first month? I think it was. And in the Old Testament scriptures, sometimes the months are given names especially when they're in the captivity in Babylon or whatever. But at other times, the months are numbered also, rather than given names. And as Henry said, the last 4 months of the Roman calendar, before the emperor started sticking their own month names in the middle of summer, were numbers 7, 8, 9, 10. And it was around the time of early Quakers that the calendar was changed from the original. Which one was Julian, Henry, the original or the second one?
Now you're confusing me.
Anyway, when they finally realized we haven't
Gregorian, there's the Gregorian and there's the Julian, right?
We haven't been keeping track of these leap days for hundreds of years. We need to count for them, and so there was sometimes when you read the journals that were written in the 1600s, the people themselves would clarify this is old calendar or new calendar when this event happened.
Gregorian is new calendar and Julian is old. Returning to the text, we are well aware that the plea is made that general usage renders these things correct, but we believe that they had their genesis in pride and idolatry, and perhaps retain somewhat of that nature still. Indeed, if asked our honest opinion about it, would we not have to own that pride has much to do with their use today?
Okay, we're talking here about several things. In terms of the pronouns, I think conservative friends 100 years ago, they perhaps all of them continued to use the original singular second person pronoun. Today, it varies quite a lot. Some people do not use it at all, others use it. I myself am both mixed. I use it and don't use it. I think not because it has that original meaning, what it meant to friends 350, 400 years ago, but it is a kind of a marker of being a member of the Society of Friends that we call liberal friends, liberal Quakers. But I, again, will use both. Perhaps more often with other conservative friends, I'll use the form thee and thine and thy. But others, I will just use you. And so it will vary. The same thing with days of the week. I don't want to confuse people if they're not familiar at all with that language and that use of terms.
And I have to admit that I'm confused on this myself, because if I were to use the singular pronouns, I would use them all the time with everybody. But I'm still stuck with wanting to be honest, and having had a mother who was an English major. The change from using thou to thee has also been accompanied by using the third person singular conjugation of the verb instead of the second person singular. So instead of saying thou art, I would be saying thee is. So I'm still conflicted on that.
I could say a bit
I'm
more.
going to do it. I'm going to end up speaking like Shakespeare and not mix my verbs with my pronouns.
Actually, it's a bit more complex, just so Conrad knows. The singular forms of verbs varied in earlier English dialects. And one form, a singular form, would be S for any singular form, added or a Z sound at the end of a word. And in another dialect, it would be N or EN. So we have a mixture of earlier English dialects here that makes it much more complex to understand how the use of pronouns in the 19th and 20th century among traditional and conservative friends became what it is. So I can understand that kind of confusion. I don't think this is a major issue or whatever today. In terms of speech, it was 100 years ago still among friends. And it is a family thing. If the parents are using plain speech with their children, the children learn it and still speak it. And they will use it among themselves in their families and friends. But in school, they know they can't use that because it won't be understood.
Returning to the text, besides these peculiarities of language, friends have long been distinguished by the simplicity of their dress and manners. Formerly, the simple garb, the scriptural language, the consistent demeanour of the Quaker of the olden time were visible tokens whereby friends were known wherever they might be. We believe that as our hearts are filled with the divine love and our lives brought under the government of Christ, our dress and behaviour will come to conform the simplicity of the gospel. Peter, in his first general epistle to the church, says, quote, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of the darkness, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light." Close quote, 1 Peter 2:9.
The simple garb. Again, early friends in the 1600s, they just got rid of all the frills on their clothing. If there were, extraneous kinds of things that more had to do with pride and arrogance or whatever, they felt, no, this is inappropriate wear. We cannot wear these sorts of clothing. It then became a kind of uniform, but in a real interesting sense, in this very same way that you find in other Christian denominations where the clergy would be wearing clothing that did not match necessarily the clothing that was out there in their society, because friends no longer wanted to be slaves to fashion. They didn't want to be always having to feel that they need to dress this way or that way, whatever the fashion gods were telling them is the current way to dress. So, in the same way that you look at clerical clothing, clerical garb, this is what was true of friends. And I think even today, among conservative friends, you won't find some gaudy, really bright clothing on most people. I think it would be noticed. I myself, many years ago, in one of my first encounters with conservative friends, was surprised when I saw one person in a meeting, a woman, really dressed up in bright colors, and another friend with a small f from California noticed that same woman too. She was there also, and she sort of stuck out. I don't think she was that this person that we were looking at was a conservative friend, but it was clear that she was just too different from the other folks there. So the garb, and I think, it's keeping it simple, keeping it plain today, that we don't wear this kind of traditional garb necessarily. Some friends still do, maybe partially they will and do, but I think that's not the point. What's more to the point is the consistent demeanor, that is the behavior, the conduct, the everyday way of life of conservative friend that really matters. This is the real token that really matters today in terms of how we present ourselves to the world.
Yes, back then, as Henry said, the men would cut off the ruffles from their cuffs, and they cut off the fancy collars from their coats, and so on and so forth. And the fancy buttons they would replace with wood or some common metal, not gold or silver. Nowadays, the fashions that are available to us commercially are so widely diverse that, as Henry said, I think most of us just choose things based on, are they comfortable, are they durable, are they modest, not are they something that I can feel proud of or show off with.
Yes, I think that's exactly what I think is what's really happening today among conservative friends. I think really the important point is not to be a slave to the world, not to be a slave to worldly fashion. Just be very honest, clear in how you're dressed. Again, there are friends who do dress in conservative Quaker garb. I mean, and some of us, I think, partially maybe, with suspenders or a black hat or whatever, or straw hat in the summer. But I know I have these myself, but I don't feel myself having to dress that way. I think I don't want it to be an obstacle to other people to think they have to speak in a certain way with certain pronouns or dress in a type of uniform that is not necessary.
Conrad and Henry, in what we've read some examples of where they resisted the sort of the emerging norms of the time. I wondered whether there had been any other examples, particularly in more recent times, where conservative friends as a group, rather than individuals acting on their conviction, but as a group, said that this is evolution of language that we're not happy with, or this is a fashion emerging that we are going to resist.
One thing that I can remember that's not doesn't apply directly to language or fashions, but does apply to whether we went along pell-mell with the culture around us, was when about 10 years ago, the burgeoning fracking for oil and natural gas came into the area where the yearly meeting owns property. And the yearly meeting was offered some fairly significant financial benefits if it would lease its mineral rights to people to extract oil and natural gas. And the argument was, well, everybody around us is doing it. We should do it too. And look at all this nice money and so on. And the yearly meeting as a body was not comfortable with doing that, with jumping on the bandwagon, and so didn't do so. As time has gone by and we know more about the environmental benefits and harms and so on, that decision may change, but it will, if it changes, it will be based on our own sense of unity that the Lord wants us to change, not because the world around us is telling us we should or everyone else is doing it.
I've also just realized in the last paragraph we read, there was a word that I think it doesn't mean today generally what it meant then. This is the word peculiar. So,
Oh, yes.
chosen generation, holy nation, a peculiar people. So, what perhaps if you could just help us with that word.
Okay, yes, that word peculiar had a different meaning in earlier English, and it's originally borrowed from a Latin word peculiaris, which basically meant special, a special people. Also, the sense of one's own people. This is God's own people, a special people to God, God's own people. That was the original sense of the word. Actually, the root of that word, the PECU, is the Latin word pecu, which means cattle. And cattle were valuable property in ancient Rome, of course. And it's the same root that you find in pecuniary, having to do with money. So valuable, special, one's own, that ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a special people that belongs to God, that you should show forth, you should show the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
I don't think we've mentioned it in this series the origin of the word Quaker. So I wonder whether that might be interesting for listeners.
Okay. Well, my best understanding of that word came from George Fox's journal. One of the times that he was hailed into court because he wouldn't take the oath of allegiance or for whatever reason. Back in those days, everyone wore hats. Women wore bonnets or some sort, and men all wore hats, probably to cover up their greasy hair that was full of lice, but who knows. It was certainly expected, again, going back to the issue of pride and people in positions of authority expecting to be treated with deference, that when George Fox came in before the judge, he didn't take off his hat because he wouldn't have taken off his hat if he'd gone into a pub to have dinner, or he wouldn't have taken off his hat as in deference to the janitor. So the judge was very angry with him because he wouldn't take off his hat. And Fox said something to the effect of, "Don't you realize that you're in the presence of God? Don't you tremble, knowing that God is observing what you're doing and how you're treating me?" And the judge, in ridicule, said, "Oh, you're quaking. You're a Quaker," and that word was used originally in a very derogatory way to address these people who, at that time, called themselves friends of truth or children of light. So they were called Quaker by the people who stoned them and took their property and did all sorts of other things. But what's interesting in what Fox reports is that night, the judge's bed shook so vigorously that it cast him out onto the floor. So at least George Fox himself felt a little bit of retribution in that. But that's where the name Quaker comes from. It's a derogatory term based on this sense that we should tremble and quake, knowing that we are in God's presence and He's bigger than we are.
One other possible source I've read is that the term Quaker or quaking might have referred to the fact that when people were listening to Quakers preaching, sometimes they would be so overcome with emotion that they would be shaking or trembling. However, in those first decades, those first generations, Quaker was a derogatory term. It was a term of derision. Quakers never spoke of themselves as being Quakers because it was a real derogatory term. They always spoke to them about themselves as friends of truth, friends of Christ. As Jesus says, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." And they felt, yes, we are commanded to do things, and we do them according to the Spirit of Christ that is commanding us. And also they call themselves children of the light or children of light. So those were the original names for that friends gave themselves. They did not call themselves Quakers. And whenever they used the words, they would use that word Quaker and say in derision, as the world would, speak about them.
So thank you, Conrad and Henry, and that brings our session to a close. Thank you also to those joining us in the session and those listening afterwards to the podcast. Until next time, goodbye.
This podcast was a production of Ohio Yearly Meeting. Featuring Henry Jason and Conrad Lindis, it was hosted and edited by Daniel Rowan. We welcome feedback on this or any of our podcast episodes. Contact us through our website, ohioyearlymeeting.org, or email us at oimconservative@gmail.com.